Craig McNamara is the son of Robert McNamara, best remembered as the former defense secretary who played a key role in the escalation of the Vietnam War in the 1960s and who would later become president of the World Bank. Craig McNamara has written a book about he and his father. It's called Because Our Fathers Lied, a memoir of truth and family from Vietnam to today. Craig McNamara, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this radio program. Thank you for taking the time to join me.
Mitch, thank you. As I mentioned to you, I'm a 45-year listener of KPA and a listener of yours. So it's an honor to be with you and to be with the listeners of our great station.
I'm assuming you started listening to KPFA when you came out to California for college.
You know, I did. I came west in 1969. I might not have been a listener at that first go around, but certainly when I came back in 1974, I've been a long time listener.
Oh, well, it's good to have you now on as a guest. There's going to be a number of people listening to this who are very familiar with who your father, Robert McNamara, was. But the longer in time we get away from the 1960s, probably fewer people as time goes on. When you meet people who aren't familiar with your father, what do you tell them? How do you describe your dad?
Oh my goodness, that's an important question because it harkens back, Mitch, to the time that I resisted the war in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and so my name, the last name McNamara, was known near and far, and it was a challenging time for me at that time because of my resistance to the war. At that time, my father had resigned as Secretary of Defense, and as you aptly said, went on to be the president of the World Bank. So throughout that era, when people would hear the name McNamara and ask me if I was related, what I would attempt to do is to say yes immediately. I would recognize that and to attempt to be in a listening mode, which is what I've tried to do throughout my life, because the issue of Robert McNamara's history in the Vietnam War is such a tragic one. And my feelings are that we need to listen to each other to understand what we all went through. And you know what's amazing to me, Mitch, is that we are still processing the American War, the Vietnam War. As long ago as it's been, it's still in many of our minds, and it's still part of our fabric.
So the name obviously followed you everywhere you went, including when you came to California in the height of the anti-war movement.
It has. It has indeed.
What was that like?
Well, I think
coming to California for school with the name McNamara and owning the name.
You know, as a 19-year-old I was born in 1950, so I'm 72 now. So as many of our listeners, we were all in this together. Many of the primarily men who fought, although women did serve during the war, many of those men are a few years older than I am. So I would say 75. And, you know, I think I need to express my appreciation for people who I knew at that time to embrace me for what I was and what I am today. So the name McNamara has many meanings. I actually, during this process of writing my memoir, it came up, something that I knew, that when President Kennedy reached out to my father to ask him to join the cabinet, the first position that was offered to him was Secretary of Treasury. And I don't know why my father turned that down and then was offered Secretary of Defense, which of course he took. And the only reason I mention that now is, how would our world be different? How would Robert McNamara's history be different if he had taken the job of Treasury, which I think he was actually very well in line for. I think he would have done a very good job. Just an interesting thought, one of many that's come about from my memoir.
Well, it is interesting because before joining the government, your father was head of Ford Motors. Is there anything in his background that would have suggested that he would become Secretary of Defense. Your father wasn't a military man before.
Absolutely none. I mean, like most of our fathers from that generation, they served in World War II. My father served in the Air Force as a statistician. I believe he was based in India and did a lot of the stats on the flights over the hump, which I believe is the Himalayas, into China. And, I think you brought up a very interesting point, Mitch, and that is, look at Robert McNamara's history and trajectory, and look who his Vietnamese counterpart partner was. And that was General Giap. General Giap was selected by Ho Chi Minh to lead the military of North Vietnam from before the American War all the way through the war. And you have these two men, neither of whom came from the military. And they were the ones that, for the duration of the war, led their countries. When General Giap died, I believe 8 or so years ago, he was celebrated by millions of Vietnamese. They came to his burial. Robert McNamara did not have that appreciation. It was a very, very different end to his life.
He would become Secretary of Defense at the beginning of the early stages of the Kennedy administration. So you must be like around 11 years old or so at this point?
Yes, you got it. We came to Washington, D.C. in January of 1961. I was either 11 or just about to turn 11. And my mom found us a wonderful school, the Quaker school, the Sidwell Friends School in Washington. So I began halfway through the 5th grade when we came to D.C.
This is the midst of, and you would be in Washington, D.C. with your father in the midst of the Cold War, height of espionage, a moment of and fears around espionage. What was it like living in the home of the Secretary of Defense during this time?
Well, you're right. I think that's an amazing, and the other bookend of that was the excitement of the Kennedy administration, the Camelot, President Kennedy, Mrs. Kennedy, and the, in essence, a new frontier coming from their past through World War II, through the Korean War, and going back to the Depression. So I think coming in to this administration must have been incredibly exciting as a 40-something-year-old, a Gen Xer in our vernacular. But can you imagine? So here he is, Robert McNamara, coming to Washington, D.C. He had been president of Ford Motor Company for less than 6 months, the first non-Ford family member to be president. And I don't think he knew it, but President Eisenhower's administration had basically planned the Bay of Pigs. The Bay of Pigs, if my history is correct, happened in April of 1961. Dad was brand new on the job. So was President Kennedy. Can we imagine what that must be like?
Did he know it was going to occur?
Very good question. I would surmise that he was briefed. As a new Secretary of Defense, I don't know the history of that, but I would assume he was briefed. And then, a year later, to have the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis, I remember him saying, and it's written in history books, that as he and President Kennedy worked through those 13 days in October of 1962, he did not know if he would see his family again. That was how close he felt our nation was coming to nuclear war.
I mean, he ordered the blockade.
Yes, he and the others, the other cabinet members. I believe Bobby Kennedy was probably involved directly in that.
So what's the house like during this period of time through the 60s? What I mean, is it just a normal household inside the home of Robert McNamara?
My mom, who was one of the most wonderful women and mothers you could imagine, she made my life very natural and normal. And so I think she worked very hard and continued as I grew older into a teenager, to be a bridge between my father and my mother. But I think the memories are of a man, my father, who would work endlessly and tirelessly as Secretary of Defense. He would get home, 8:30 at night. And I do want to share with you a memory that I have, and that is back to the Cuban Missile Crisis. After that event, Mrs. Kennedy gave President Kennedy and my father a plaque as a memorabilia of this almost catastrophic event. It was a little piece of walnut wood, 4 inches by 4 inches of black walnut. On top of it was a silver Tiffany calendar with the month of October of 1962. The 13 days were deeper in the calendar. So the memory I have, and it said on the top, JFK to RSM, Robert S. McNamara. And my memory is as a 12-year-old, 13-year-old, my father coming home from the Defense Department, having a scotch and soda in his right hand, and he was left-handed, and he would have his left hand on this calendar. His fingers, his digits were going, feeling the indented days, the 13 days. I can only imagine what was going through his mind as I was, a 13-year-old telling him, "Whoa, what happened at school today?" So those are, if that tells you a little bit of the consternation in our lives at that time. And it got darker as I got older.
Why?
As the war accelerated, as Robert McNamara's participation in it grew, as I grew and became a teenager into my 16, 17, and 18-year-old self, realizing that the war was wrong, that it was not justified, that it was horrific, that it was killing Vietnamese, Cambodians, Laotians, and U.S. soldiers. And it was largely my father and other cabinet members who were perpetrating this lie in this war, and that became very difficult.
Did you ever talk to him about it?
I attempted to, and it's one of, I think, our great failures, our being his and mine. He was a man who was very skilled at compartmentalization. So he could take different parts of himself, different parts of his life, and attempt to compartmentalize them. He was not successful in terms of the war. A war, you cannot compartmentalize a war. And that war bled out from his compartments into emotions that he could no longer control. When he left the Department of Defense as secretary, and he was in the White House, he was receiving the Medal of Honor from President Johnson, and he had a prepared speech that he could not give. He was so emotionally upset that he had to thank the president and say that I'll respond at a different time. To me, that's the inability to compartmentalize a war. That's when a war runs out of you, and you need to accept it.
When do you start to develop your political consciousness and concerns over the war that your dad was executing?
For me, and I speak about it a little bit in my book, most likely in high school. And interestingly enough, as I mentioned, I started off at Sidwell Friends and absolutely loved my education there. I think if there's any religion that I am most attached to, it'd probably be Quaker Friends. But a good friend of mine left after the 8th grade and went away and showed up at the end of our 9th grade and said, "Hey, I've been at this great school. You got to check it out." I didn't know, but he was dialed in from grandpa to father to go to a prep school. I didn't even know what a prep school was. And I ended up going there. And I would say the benefit of that school was making very lifelong friendships, which I have today. And one of those is with Rick King. Rick was the president of our class at that school, and he introduced a teach-in to the school, and I'm believing that was 1967, 66-ish, probably 6-ish. Could have been 65. No, I think 1966. And a noted Southeast Asian professor, Southeast Asian professor from Dartmouth came as our teach-in leader, and it was profound. I had called my father in one of those glass payphone booths from school, asking him if he had any information that would, in essence, back up his position, the U.S. position, as to why we're in the war. And to my recollection, nothing came in my mailbox. And so I went into this teach-in, in essence, empty-handed. And what I got
you wanted to go to this teach-in with information to defend the government, to defend the war.
I think you're probably correct. I was 15, 16, still coming to grips with the atrocity of the war and my father's role in it, and probably looking for some factual information that would justify our position. And it didn't come. So it's a very interesting fact, never discussed with my father, what was going on in his mind at that time in terms of his son.
And the fact that it never came is indicative,
I believe so,
of the ability of you two being able to talk about this thing.
Yes, and it never improved throughout his life. He was just impenetrable. He had a firewall that I've often asked, certainly during this process of writing the memoir, why was that? Part of it was the idea of compartmentalization. And Mitch, I think another part is his father was significantly older than his mother. His father died, I believe, when my father was in his late teens. His mother was extremely strict, put a huge amount of pressure on my father to excel. I think I met my grandmother maybe 5 times. What I'm getting at is I think those early years in all of our lives are so important to who we are today. And I don't think he had a good foundation in maybe that judgment. Something that I want to talk with you and our listeners about is loyalty. I don't know if this is the time to address it.
Go ahead.
So he did write what I'll call a memoir, his memoir called In Retrospect, and that was in 1995. And it came out, I don't think he was anticipating the pushback that he got from that book. Very few vets responded with a positive impression. Many others said, "You son of a bitch. Why?" And my question to him was, why could you not have done this earlier? Why couldn't you have said the war was wrong? And by the way, he did not go as far as saying, "I'm sorry for my actions." And what he did say when I questioned him, this is probably the only breakthrough that I had. I said, "Why?" And there was a long pause, and he said, "Loyalty." And I said, "Well, what do you mean loyalty?" And this is what he said. I found an article about him in Life magazine just 2 months after he either resigned or was fired in 1968. So this was a Life magazine article, May 10th, 1968. Very lengthy, about 15 or so pages. And this was in the middle of it. This is Robert McNamara. Around Washington, there is this concept of the higher loyalty. I think it's a heretical concept, this idea that there's a duty to serve the nation above the duty to serve the president, and that you're justified in doing so. It will destroy democracy if it's followed. You have to subordinate a part of yourself, a part of your views, end quote. And I go on to say, wait a minute, he took the same oath of office that men and women take today, which is, I do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. So my question for my father should have been, why didn't you get out? If you knew that the war was not winnable as early as 1965, or whenever you realized it, as your son, I'm telling you, it was your duty to resign and to join forces with others of your same beliefs.
Do you think he would have responded? Do you think he would have answered it? Do you think he would have answered your question?
Later on in his life, that begs the question, Mitch. What would my father think? What would he think about your and my conversation today? What would he think if he picked up my memoir? I think it would be the beginning of the truth. I think it would be the beginning of a conversation of the past and the present and the future. He was a very bright individual, incredibly capable.
He was considered a genius.
Yes, and those 8 years, 61-ish to 68, those are the years that forever sculpted his life. He had a very successful career as president in the Ford Motor Company, very successful career as president of the World Bank, went on to, in his credit, he was a staunch anti-nuclear believer, and wanted to reduce, if not end, the probability of nuclear war. So I don't know if I could have changed him about the loyalty aspect, but we would have had a good conversation.
You think he would have actually talked about it, though? I guess, it's interesting when I was listening, when you were talking about how he just wouldn't talk to you when you were younger about the war. It reminded me, and it's a very different dynamic, but when I hear these kind of stories, it reminds me of that generation and my own grandfather. Yes. My own grandfather served in World War II. He was on one of the gliders that on D-Day went into Normandy. It was one of the most dangerous things. Only a historian later told me it was one of the most dangerous things you could have been involved in. Yeah. And I say only later a historian told me this because my grandfather just never talked about the war. And I tried to get him to do it. Everyone tried to get him to talk about it, but he was just the quietest man we ever knew. But on this specifically, yes. not a word ever.
Just out of curiosity, Mitch, do you remember what year he would have been born roughly?
It's funny. He went on, it was supposed to launch on his 21st birthday. Yeah. But because of weather conditions, he was born on June 5th, but because of weather convention situation, it actually launched on June 6th.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, that's very much the case with, I think, most of the men and women who fought in World War II. They just did not want to share their feelings. And, writing a memoir is a unique opportunity. And I think during it, anyone who writes it, you should be questioning yourself, am I accurate? Are my memories truthful? And are they based in reality? I believe they are. I really, truly believe they are. And I did quite a bit of research. But then you get into the question of fault. Can I fault my father for? I don't know, but I don't think he truly believed in the domino theory, which would have been that cascading effect. If Vietnam goes, then Laos goes, then Cambodia goes, then Southeast Asia goes. Having grown up with Russia, I'm sure they were concerned about that aspect of it. But when I think what we did, we dropped 7.5 million tons of bombs on Vietnam. That's 3 times the amount that was dropped in World War II. We used over 18 million gallons of Agent Orange, And we used over 388,000, excuse me, did I say 18 million tons? 18 million tons of Agent Orange, and we used 388,000 tons of napalm. And those three issues, bombs, Agent Orange, and napalm, live on today. They live on in our soldiers. They live on in the men and families of our men and women who fought in Vietnam, and they live on in the unexploded ordnance in the rice paddies and fields and mountains of Vietnam, and in the women and men who are having children in Vietnam who are facing birth defects. And so, if we go full circle here, Robert McNamara, President of Ford Motor Company, Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, architect of the Vietnam War, what could he have done? My hope is that he would have left office and attempted to end the war. He did not do that. Second strategy, what could he have done? He could have apologized. He could have listened to the men and women, families, daughters, sons who lost loved ones. And he could have attempted to say, I'm going to do something to ameliorate that situation. I'm going to try to find ways of ending the issues of Agent Orange. I'm going to find ways of addressing the unexploded armaments and munitions in Vietnam. And I'm going to take care of our veterans in this country who are suffering today. That's what he could have done.
Do you think he felt duty bound?
Not to do that, or not to do that?
Duty. Do you think he felt duty bound to going just back to his time as Secretary of Defense? Do you think he realized it was wrong at the time that he was doing his duty?
Oh, I see. What I know is what I've learned through reading history. Yeah. And I must remind our listeners, I'm a farmer. I'm an organic walnut farmer. I'm not a historian or a journalist. I've learned more about my father through reading history books or listening to friends like Daniel Ellsberg, who lives right there in Berkeley, who's been a tremendous mentor to me, a man who's taught us all so much. So did he feel duty bound? Yes, he did. Did he feel that loyalty to the presidents he served? Yes, he did. Did he feel that he was probably in between the Joint Chiefs of Staff who wanted to increase bombing, who probably would have used tactical nuclear weapons, and the president? Yes, he did. So those are heavy, heavy places to put oneself. And in a certain sense, who am I to judge? Well, I think we are capable.
You're his son.
Yeah,
you're his son.
Yeah.
Do you think your dad was a war criminal?
I encourage our listeners, if you haven't done so already, to see The Fog of War, Errol Morris's incredible documentary that came out in 2003. Errol spent 22 hours filming with my father, and The Fog of War is a phenomenal film. And the reason I mention it on this issue of war criminal is that my father addresses very clearly World War II and General LeMay. He quotes General LeMay as saying, had we not won in World War II, he and they would have been considered war criminals. If I'm correct in the documentary, my father goes on to surmise that may be the same case for Vietnam. So the question is, do I feel my father's a war criminal? That's a very heavy place for me to be. Those who read my memoir will realize it truly is a love story. My mother and father loved me deeply, and I loved them. They introduced me to the Sierras, to the Cascades, to the Rockies, and hiking and climbing and traveling, to wilderness and Mother Nature. And for that, I am forever grateful. And he made disastrous decisions along with President Kennedy and President Johnson. I believe, And, war criminal is an international standard, and somewhat difficult to define. I believe that my father was a war criminal.
You think he believed he was a war criminal? That's what he was communicating in Errol Morris's film?
I cannot say that. We'll have to go back over. He did not say that. But if you take the definition that Curtis LeMay used of winning the war, well, we did not win the American war. We did not win it. We lost it. So it kind of leaves it hanging.
You just referenced the loving aspect of your relationship to your parents, including your father. And of course, here we are.
Yeah.
Really focusing on him as defense secretary.
Mm-hmm.
Is that difficult?
It is not, because so many years, I realized that my entire life, my entire adult life from 12 years old has been lived through the lens of the Vietnam War. And that my father was such a critical player in the development and aggressions that the United States took in Vietnam. In almost every turn, every decision I made a decision to drop out of college in 1971. I made a decision to travel, work and travel on subsistent farms in Latin America for 2 years. I made a decision to work on a collective farm in the state of Michoacan, Mexico, and hoeing sugarcane. I decided to become a farmer. All of those decisions were based on, in one way or another, tethered back to Vietnam, tethered back to my father. Those of us who grew up in the 60s, there really was a back to the land movement. And I would say I have that in my soul. I'm a first generation farmer. I don't, maybe somewhere in generations past, there's a Irish potato farmer in our genealogy, but I'm the first of our family to be a farmer.
And you were a part of the anti-war movement, especially, probably not just exclusively here, but when you were in the San Francisco Bay Area going to school, your dad must have known that. Did you ever talk to him about that? Did he know?
Well, it's so interesting that you mentioned that. He must have.
But again, just never talked about it?
Never. Wow. Never talked about it. It's just one of those remarkable issues. And he was out of office when I became very active in the resistance movement. I want to pause here for a second in terms of the men and women who resisted the war. I have the deepest appreciation for both the men and women who were drafted, who enlisted and went to war, and I have the most deep appreciation for those who resisted the war, those who didn't fight, and those who were in country in Vietnam who resisted the war. I want to make it very clear that we were wrong in the way our men and women returned from Vietnam and the reaction that we as a society gave them. That is wrong. So many of the conversations that I'm having today are with people in their mid-70s who over and over again said, I was 19 years old, I went there and I came back a changed person, and I've been changed for the rest of my life. That is what war inherently does. And that begs the question, why don't we take care of our veterans? Why don't we invest in our veterans? You can say that we are to a degree, but we're not. We're not spending the trillions of dollars that we should be to help them reintegrate and finding purpose and meaning for their lives. We're not doing that properly.
Because you were open about who your father was, how did anti-war activists respond to you?
I can think of myself as a 19, 20, and 21-year-old. And I had deep internal searches. I think we all do at that age, existential, crises that we face. I believe that my peer group accepted me for who I was. And it was only later, a long time later, at the Telluride Film Festival in 2003, when the Fog of War was being shown. And believe it or not, in the same audience where Alice Waters was. Alice is a wonderful friend and visionary, and I think of her as one of my great mentors. Also in that audience was Steve Bannon. This is a unique time, viewing the Fog of War. Afterwards, I went to a dinner with my peer group. My father was invited to other dinners. And at that evening dinner, there was a person who I never met or got the name of sitting across from me, probably my age or a year or so older than me. And I could tell that he just had the deepest hatred for my father and for me. And it hurt me deeply, because I wished that we had had a conversation so that he could say perhaps that his brother died, or that his father was killed in Vietnam, or that he hated Robert McNamara and consequently hated me. And that would have given us an opportunity to listen to each other and to better understand each other. So that I use that as an example. I did not encounter that when I was 19 or 20, but it may have been those issues that caused me to leave this country of ours for almost 3 years.
That is interesting, that what you regretted in that encounter was that you didn't get an opportunity to hear what he said, not necessarily a chance to explain yourself.
I think that's the crux of where we are. And actually, Mitch, it's the crux of where we are today. We need to stop, listen, and understand. We all have significant points of view, right? And I've got my opinion. You've got your opinion. Everybody on the street and Telegraph Avenue and the Mission has their opinions. Let's stop and listen and see if there's not. Let's find the common ground. And if the common ground is minuscule, then let's embrace that and see if we can't grow something. As a matter of fact, as a farmer, we use the term fertigation. So that's a bringing together of fertilizer in irrigation. So I'm an organic walnut grower. So we fertigate our trees with a liquid organic fertilizer. So it gives both the water and the fertigation. And I use this same analogy. We need to fertigate our friendships right now. They're all that we have, right? In this topsy-turvy world of injustice, of Roe versus Wade, Roe v. Wade, of a changed climate, all we really have is our community. And we need to fertigate our communities in order to move forward.
I did want to talk about your travels south and then your time in Chile, and also how it relates back to your dad. You go to Chile when Salvador Allende,
yes,
president, a socialist who was elected into power.
Yes. And you know what's interesting? When I was a sixth grader at Sidwell Friends, Mrs. Dater, our sixth grade teacher, I think for the whole year we studied South America, and I chose Chile, and that was my study. And I had always had it in my heart and mind to go to Chile. So leaving the Bay Area in probably March of 1961, my goal was to go to Chile. And my two friends said, well, we got to go on motorcycles. We got to get I said, come on, let's just take a VW bus or hitchhike or what. No, got to go on motorcycle. So I shared a motorcycle with a friend. We made it all the way through Mexico, Central America, got to Panama. We didn't realize there was no road from Panama to South America. So we made it eventually to Bogota. My two friends said, enough already. We're going to stay in Bogota. And I wasn't done. So I left my motorcycle and hitchhiked basically from Colombia to Tierra del Fuego. And I arrived in Santiago, Chile in September of 1971 as Salvador Allende was celebrating his first year as a freely elected socialist president. And the country was, excited. Fidel Castro came for 3 weeks. It was, for me, I turned 21 years old on the road. So I was 21 when I arrived in Santiago in 71. And it was a remarkable experience to celebrate, to understand, to see land reform. And of course, all of that came to a tragic end when Salvador Allende was assassinated on September 11th of 1973.
Were you in Chile then?
I was not. I had been in Chile. I spent almost a year and a half on Easter Island, which I didn't know at the time, but that is, I didn't know it when I arrived in Chile. That is part of Chile. And I was able to start a dairy cooperative of cow dairy. And I realized that things were beginning to fall apart. And interestingly enough, I'm sure the CIA was very involved in the demise in Chile and the undermining of the Allende government. And I believe that the World Bank, where my father was president at the time, was also probably involved in Chile's loss of credit and in loans and in things that were important to supporting the government.
Did you ever talk to your father about that?
Would
he ever talk to you about it, I guess is
well, it's interesting, Mitch. Two things happened. I was sitting in a cafe one morning in Santiago reading the El Mercurio, which is the national newspaper. And there was an article. Robert McNamara was in Santiago as a keynote speaker at the UNCTAD, which is the United Nations Trade Conference. We didn't have, of course, cell phones. This was 1971. There was no communication that I had with my father. Wasn't calling. I wasn't at an address. So literally, we were a kilometer or two apart. Had no idea that either of us were within communication range. So we had no communication. Years later, I believe that I did question him about the role of the World Bank in the demise of Allende, and I don't think he responded fully on that. I think history, I don't know if you're a historian in this area, but I think history will say that the World Bank negatively impacted the Allende government.
Who was Rich Rusk?
Oh, that's an important story within my story. Rich Rusk was the son of Dean Rusk, and Dean Rusk was the Secretary of State selected by President Kennedy, just like my father was selected. And Rich and I don't think we ever met. He reminded me over the phone that we may have been in the East Room of the White House when my father and his father were sworn in, when they took the oath of office. But throughout our lives, we didn't meet. We became very close in the later 2015, 16, 17. And my daughter and I, Emily, who's now 30, we traveled to Vietnam for 3 weeks in November of 2017. And Rich Rusk and I were exchanging emails because he was preparing to go with his son for the 50th anniversary of the My Lai massacre. And they were going to do that early in 2018. And Rich was sharing with me emails questioning, do you think that it's appropriate that I go to Vietnam, given the history that my father had? And I said, of course it is, Rich. And let me just go back a second. Rich and his father separated for 14 years. Rich moved to Alaska, became a truck driver, a fisherman, didn't speak with his father for 14 or more years. He returned to Athens, Georgia. They wrote a book together. Dean Rusk never apologized, but it was a good book. So here he is getting ready for his trip to Vietnam, which would have been probably February of 2018. And in mid-January, he jumped off a bridge and committed suicide. And I don't know, Rich, to know if that was I don't know the depth to which Vietnam entered into that decision. I can only surmise that it did. And what a tragedy if that is indeed the case. And that just goes back to the relevance of Vietnam today in our lives. It's still part of the fabric of our lives. I want to read to you one quote, if you would allow me. It's from the opening of my father's memoir in retrospect. And remember, this was 1965. This is Robert McNamara saying, "It is clear our nation has neither fully understood nor fully come to terms with Vietnam. The wounds remain unhealed and the lessons unlearned." That was 1995. And I would say that is, he could read it today. We have not learned anything.
Is there any kind of a connection that children from, like, your situation, maybe, think of George W. Bush's children, or, Donald Rumsfeld's children. I mean, I guess we know about Dick Cheney's his child, Liz Cheney's in Congress. Is there a connection from children of parents who, were involved in government and may be accused of extreme wrongdoing?
That their fathers would have been accused of wrongdoing?
It'd probably be their fathers, but could be mothers too. I mean,
but not themselves.
Well, I mean, just a connection
that their parents,
children, just sort of like, that's the connection, and they find kind of commonality, maybe the way you did with Rich Rusk.
Great question, and I don't believe it exists.
Yeah.
In my case, it would be very thin. It'd be very few. I grew up with Robert Kennedy's children, so Kathleen Kennedy and I are about the same age. Joe Kennedy, he and I were good friends as teenagers. David died. Bobby Kennedy Jr., we all know, is very involved. I think what you're asking, is there a network? Is there a community that binds us together? I don't believe so.
I mean, it sounds like what bounded you, and correct me if I'm wrong, you to Rich Rusk was this shared history.
Yes. And the fact that we sought each other out late in life. It's a very, someone also asked me that question recently. Is there unity? Is there a bond? Is there communication? And in my case, no. I'm guessing probably doesn't exist, or maybe with my memoir, maybe people we will create that, but not to my knowledge.
But do you think there's something that the kids do have to wrestle with emotionally, psychologically?
Oh, very much so. And it's interesting. That begs the question about generational trauma. That's a term that I was not used to or aware of 5 years ago. And yet it's very, very powerful. And what I've learned subsequently is that we, you and me and our listeners, have the ability to change the generational trauma that we've grown up with. So my wife and I have 3 wonderful adult millennial offspring. And it's my obligation to change the generational, or to attempt to recognize and do my part in changing that trauma that came down through my genealogy.
Craig McNamara, thank you for taking this time to join me today.
Thank you, Mitch. It means the world to me as a listener of KPFA, as an anti-war activist, and somebody committed to a peaceful future. Thank you so much.
Again, Craig McNamara is the author of the book, Because Our Fathers Lied, a memoir of truth and family from Vietnam to today.